Thanks so much, everyone who's joining us tonight. Suzanne, we're live.
Good evening. My name is Suzanne Hurwitz, and along with my husband, Stephen, we serve as chairs of Cornell Parents Giving. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our first Family Fellows event for this academic year. And what a unique year it is. Normally, we'd be meeting one another in New York City, but I'm so glad that at least this year, no matter where you live, you can join us tonight for this event. I want to start by thanking you. Your support of Cornell is critical in many ways and is so meaningful to the university leadership, especially right now during this difficult time. It gives them the encouragement and validation that all the hard work they have done to open the campus this fall is recognized and appreciated. Our philanthropy is also helping to ensure that there is funding to reimagine the student experience as this pandemic continues, because at Cornell, the student experience is in a class of its own. When Cornellians talk about any person, any study, they really mean it. From forming an entrepreneurial team to doing research on sustainable pathways, students have unlimited options of exploration at Cornell. I am continually impressed at all the areas where Cornell is pushing the envelope and being a thought leader, which brings me to our program for tonight. One of the areas that Cornell is leading the way is through the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs. Directed by former US Congressman Steve Israel, the Institute is the only academically based institute of politics and global affairs located in the New York metropolitan area. Its mission is to raise the discourse and deepen people's understanding of both domestic and international affairs. And it is doing so through programs that bring people from all points on the political spectrum to the table. With that, I'm pleased to introduce one of our own Family Fellows members, Tegan Goddard, who will serve as our moderator for this exciting conversation. Tegan and his wife, Sarah, are the parents of Chase, a 2019 Arts and Sciences graduate, and Alexander, a current senior in Arts and Sciences. When Tegan is not doing his most important work of being a fabulous dad, he is influencing politics through his writing and digital media properties. He is the founder of Political Wire, one of the earliest and most influential political websites, which he began 20 years ago. Tegan also runs Political Job Hunt, Electoral Vote Map, and the Political Dictionary. Tegan is also co-author of You Won, Now What? A political management book hailed by prominent journalists and politicians from both parties. In addition, his essays on politics and public policy have appeared in dozens of newspapers across the country, and he has served as a policy advisor to a US senator and governor. Please join me in welcoming Tegan Goddard as moderator for our discussion this evening.
Thanks so much, Suzanne, for that kind introduction, and welcome to everybody. I'd like to thank all of the Cornell families taking part tonight as well. In addition to lending your children, your philanthropy makes Cornell a better place, as Suzanne said. So thank you very much. Second, I'd like to really thank the Cornell Institute of Politics and Global Affairs for sponsoring this event. I've been involved with the Institute since the beginning, and it's nothing short of incredible. When in-person events were still a thing, we had fantastic talks in New York City with Speaker Nancy Pelosi, former White House Chief of Staff Reince Priebus, and House Intelligence Committee Chair Adam Schiff. But the last 8 months haven't slowed things down. In fact, I'd say virtual events like these have actually expanded the Institute's influence and reputation across the country. So I would urge you, if you're interested in politics, get involved. It's really a wonderful organization, and Congressman Israel has done a wonderful job kicking this thing off. Finally, I'd like to thank Penny Chick and her incredible team for putting on this event. This is my 6th year involved with the Family Fellows and Parents Committee. They're probably getting sick of me by now, but my wife, Sarah, and I have really enjoyed these programs, and particularly in getting to know Penny and her team as friends. So thank you all. Now let's get to our speakers tonight. It's a terrific discussion. We have Tom Reynolds, a former congressman from New York who represented the suburbs outside of Buffalo. And he's currently a senior policy advisor at Holland and Knight in Washington, D.C. Tom advises clients on legislative and regulatory matters and strategy, drawing from his 35 years of service in elected public office. Steve Israel is the director of Cornell's Institute of Politics and Global Affairs, and also a former congressman from New York, representing the New York suburbs. Steve left Capitol Hill after 16 years, and as I've heard him often say, he was both unindicted and undefeated to pursue a career as a writer. In addition to writing 2 critically acclaimed satires of Washington, he's also a regular commentator on MSNBC, and he writes for The Hill. Both Tom and Steve served in the House leadership and as chairs of their party's House campaign committees, the national fundraising and recruitment arms for their party's House campaigns. They have a special view into our national politics. In many ways, they're the perfect people to talk today, since they not only understand politics enough to get elected many times, but they also know the specific districts around the country that might swing control of power in Washington in next month's elections. So welcome to you both. And now let's get to some questions.
Thank you.
I'd love to start with the presidential race if we can. That's the thing that I think most people are focused on. With 13 days to go, the polling averages currently show Joe Biden leading Donald Trump nationally by 10 percentage points. But we know from 2016 that the national polls don't tell the full story. So the 538 election forecast also shows Joe Biden with an 88% chance of winning. That's looking at all the individual state polls and their averaging. What I'd like to ask you first, and I'll start with you, Tom, do you believe the polls are correct, or will Americans be surprised as they were 4 years ago?
I don't think I know. I'm a polling fanatic. I read a lot of polls. I've just seen a lot of House polls over the last several months. And I've certainly watched both Real Clear Politics and other averages, 538. I've talked to a number of Republican consultants, and they're beginning to know that they're not sure with the variations or looking at the average, what it is, just exactly where we are. I don't doubt that a snapshot of the national averages is about where it is. What I don't know as we get into the states, particularly the battleground states, is the modeling used, have they learned their lesson from 2016, or will we find after this election that the polls were somewhat off? I've really actually urged my party to take a real deep look at this. A benchmark poll now is $30,000. And when I'm looking at watching, even on Long Island, where Steve is from, polls with well-known pollsters, where some of the management of campaigns have brought in a pollster following that to take another look, it just tells me that we're not sure of where we are as we look at these states battleground by battleground. Last 2 things that has been a long answer is the modeling is taking a woman, for instance, who is a white woman that is degreed from the suburbs and figured out that model. The question is it some college? Is it no college? Is it college educated as they've done the modeling and turnout? The second is the Trump world claims that they have done massive registration that would not necessarily be reflected in that. And the question is, what is the model doing with that if it's the case? And so some of this is the usual crowing projections and BS that campaigns do, but some of it might very be real. And what are the pollsters doing to capture it?
Your point about party registration is certainly an interesting one, because the Republicans do seem to have taken the edge there, at least in this race. Same question to you, Steve. What do you think? Will we be surprised on November 4th?
Well, Tegan, thank you for your leadership in the Institute and for moderating. Suzanne, thank you very much. Before we begin, I have to say a word about my brother, Tom Reynolds. People are quite accustomed to seeing screens like this on MSNBC or CNN or Fox, where Democrats and Republicans are going for each other's throats. You're not going to see that tonight. You're going to see some foreign members of Congress, political operatives agreeing disagreeably. We're going to have some fun Tom chaired the Republican Congressional Campaign Committee. I chaired the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. We were like two football coaches on opposite sides of the field who commiserated, while we were trying to kill each other's parties. And it's been, when I was asked to find the smartest and most politically astute Republican around, I went right to Tom. So Tom, thank you for doing this. Tegan, I will confess that I still have PTSD from election night 2016. One of my worst moments, and Tom, I know you're going to appreciate this. I'm sure you were never in this kind of situation. I walked out on stage at the New York Times. They had asked Congressman Hakeem Jeffries and I to do kind of a pre-election talk with Scaramucci, who was representing the Trump campaign. And I walked out and I opened up by saying, in 3 hours, Hillary Clinton will be the president of the United States. So I have been a little reticent to share my predictions since.
Well, I was wrong at 16 myself, Steve.
Okay, well, that makes me feel better. In fact, I think we were all wrong. I think it's going to be a very tight election. I think Tom is right. The sampling is an important consideration. The fact that the Trump campaign has focused on registering new voters is an important consideration. My rule of thumb has been to subtract 3 points from every battleground poll that I look at and from the national poll and give it to Trump. Because what elected Donald Trump in 2016 was the undercount that they knew about and my party didn't. The undercount are people who just didn't want to talk to a pollster. The undercount includes people who didn't want to say I'm voting for Donald Trump because they thought there was some stigma to it. So I am rather pessimistic about the polling. I factor in my own 2 or 3 point, well, actually 3 to 4 point reduction in Biden's numbers, give it to Trump. When you do that, it's a very close election. Biden wins, but it is a much closer election than it appears right now.
That seems to mirror. Oh, I'm sorry, Tom, go ahead.
I kind of share that. And if you looked at New York race, when I look at Trump's numbers in some of the congressional seats of New York where he might do well, such as the now Chris Jacobs seat in Western New York, his numbers are compressed, or other parts of the state, which says that he may win that congressional seat, therefore he may win some of these states. But as we talk later, he's not going to have an impact necessarily on Senate and House. And if some of these battleground states go awry, he's going to have an impact not only on a must-have state he needs, but it'll have an impact on down ballot as well.
What's interesting is that the comments that both of you are making are obviously reflected by the Biden campaign. The Biden campaign's putting out memos saying that the race is going to be closer than you're hearing pundits talk about. I will just point out, though, in polling discrepancies, they can be wrong both ways. And Steve, they could be wrong the other way. And if they were wrong the other way, we might be looking at a 1980 presidential race, or a 1984 presidential race, which is a landslide one way.
And Pagan, I took the time to read the history of 1980 while I was around and a voter. I wanted to refresh that there were only, I think, 4 electoral votes that occurred for Carter in those states. Or 4 states. It could. That's part of, I think, my point of where you ask about the polls. This could be anything from very close to a blowout.
So what I think everybody watching tonight is probably going to be knowing, because in 13 days we're all going to be in front of the TV. We're going to be watching the results come in. What states are you guys going to be watching to get an early indication of what's happening here? And there's obviously some states that we could probably all agree on, and there are other states that, depending on which way they go, might make the difference. I know that 4 years ago, when I was watching Virginia, in the rural areas of the Virginia, after the polls closed at 6 o'clock, I knew something was going on. This was not going to be the race that people were talking about. What are you looking at this year, Tom?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Tom.
Well, first of all, when you have Mike Bloomberg investing $100 million in Florida in order to see if he can assist the Vice President Biden into winning the state. You've got to watch, can Trump hold that or does he not? As always a close state. It's a pure kind of purple state that they look at. I'm watching Georgia more than some Republicans might, because I think we're having difficulty in Georgia on the presidential, but I believe those two Senate races could become runoffs for January based on Georgia law. We have to look at Arizona, in my opinion, to see whether the president can right himself there or whether he does not win Arizona, because that then changes pieces. Maybe because I was born in Pennsylvania, because every president in my adult life has said as a Republican, they can go carry it. I was shocked as the President Trump carried Pennsylvania. I'll be curious to see just what is going to happen in that state, because both campaigns are working it hard. And as we look, I'll be fascinated. Does he get any traction in the Northern Great Lakes, which would be Wisconsin or Minnesota? Because he needs a pathway to win. And I think Florida and Arizona are essential in that. And then where else does he go?
How about you, Steve? What do you think? What states do you be watching?
Let me kind of riff off of what Tom was saying and give you a sense of what the Biden campaign will be looking at. So if you break it down, obviously 7 pure battleground states: Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Iowa, Ohio, Florida, North Carolina. Then there are 3 Biden must-holds. He's got to win Minnesota, New Hampshire, and Nevada, because Hillary Clinton won those states in 2016. And one thing Tom Reynolds and I know is that you don't win by losing. So he's got to protect those states. And then President Trump has 3 must-wins as well. To Tom's point, Georgia is one of them. South Carolina is another, and Texas. So those are 3 must-wins. So so the battlefield is set. 7 pure battlegrounds, 6 must-protects for each. Here's what I'll be watching on election night, mostly as a function of time. Florida closes at 7 p.m. Actually, a good part of Florida closes at 7 p.m. The Panhandle closes a little later.
Yeah.
And so I will be watching, because the Panhandle is in a different time zone. I'm going to be watching 2 counties in Florida that will give us a sense of how the night will go. I'll be watching Dade County, and kind of getting a sense of what hurt Hillary Clinton 2016 was she did not perform well in Dade County. She projected a much better result. And so if Dade County, Miami-Dade County, is reporting that roughly the same results as Hillary Clinton had, that would concern me. But the other county I'm looking at is Sumter County in Florida. Sumter County, as you probably know, Tegan, that's where the Villages are located. And the Villages is just this sprawling, massive retirement community where the politics is so intense that they have these golf cart competitions with Trump signs and Biden signs. Trump should win the Villages by 65%. It's a very Republican area. But if Trump is winning the Villages by, high 50s, and Biden is holding his own in the Villages, even if Biden is coming in the low 40s, mid 40s, that tells me that Sumter County might actually be competitive, which tells me that Florida is going to be very competitive. And I would believe that Biden will win Florida if that's how it plays out. And if they call Florida at 7 o'clock, there's just kind of a psychological effect. If they're calling Florida at 7 p.m., then I think the rest of the night is a very good night for Joe Biden. If Donald Trump loses Florida, it's hard for him to go elsewhere to protect himself.
So Steve, along those lines, do you think we'll know a winner on election night? Or, in 2000, we didn't learn for 5 weeks.
Yeah.
2004, it took about 24 hours. What about this year?
Tegan, I don't know. Everybody has heard what the expectation is, which is the president will do very well on election day. And then in the ensuing days, as these ballots are counted, and it's going to take a while to count these ballots. Joe Biden will narrow the gap, and and I believe will actually surpass Donald Trump. But if President Trump is saying in that intervening time that those mail-in ballots are fraudulent, they're rigged, I'm the duly elected president, they're trying to steal this thing away from me, I have just very deep concerns about what happens to the fabric of the country in that eventuality.
Yeah, Tom, do you think we'll know a winner on November 3rd?
It's unlikely. I think party leaderships will try to declare winners. I don't think necessarily the candidates will, just based on what they're seeing. But we have an inordinate amount of mail-in voting, and where Steve and I hail from in New York, and many of the watching this tonight, they can't even start counting ballots until election day, 7 days after that. So depending on the state, it's going to be murky. I think there'll be a sense of what we think happened. And Steve, I would add in Florida, I read someplace that Pinellas County, which is now where Charlie Crist represents, is a interesting swing county that the Floridians take a look at what's going on, in addition to the two that you cited. But basically, Steve thinks about 9 o'clock, he can switch over to a movie channel because he's going to know what Florida did, and there goes it all. And but I think Florida is going to be a major player and be some indication of what kind of night Republicans are going to have sitting through that.
So, by the way, Kagan, let me just say,
yeah,
those of you who want really interesting party guests who can go into specific counties and specific states, Tom and I are your guys. Invite us to dinner. We will just bore you to tears.
Well, let's, so on the political calendar now, we have an election on November 3rd, and there's really only one other big event on the political calendar, which is on Thursday night, which is the final presidential debate. And Donald Trump skipped the second debate. He canceled that one. So, Tom, if you were advising Trump, he's running behind in the polls. What does he need to do on Thursday night?
Well, I sometimes live what I preach, and I knew coming on this show tonight that Stephen has been doing virtual interviews like this for a very long time in the pandemic season. And I, while on Zooms a lot, or I'm not on political type panel discussions, but I felt confident enough to do it, even though he had every skill set how to outmaneuver me. I would tell the president that I am a very structured, organized, methodical, old school politician. Therefore, a debate is about putting your best foot forward. And some of that is a Lee Atwater teaching, an old national chair under George H.W. Bush. And sometimes you just stay quiet and let the other guy kind of undo himself. And he had a much better way of saying it. But Trump reminded me of a horse trying to come out of the gate versus in for the race of the length of the debate. I would say that he has got to use the discipline that he's capable of doing in a debate to set an image that will be the last outside of what he's doing on rallies in the schedule for this 2 weeks, to leave an impression that Americans are searching. I like your policies. I'm not sure I can tolerate you for 4 more years. Give me some reason to like the policies and think I should invest that vote. That's what I would tell him he has to do.
So Steve, just before we came on this event, there was an article actually in The Hill, which you write for regularly, which said that Joe Biden's strategy is to let Trump be Trump. Do you think that's right?
Well, it depends on which Trump shows up. Look, first of all, I do not think that this debate or that most debates fundamentally change the trajectory of an election like this. Like 98% of this electorate has made up its mind. It's love or loathe. They're not going anywhere. There's no migration based on a debate. Although one could argue that the president's performance in the first debate, that some of the undecideds did break for Biden, but there were like 15 left. There are 15 undecideds left. So what does that mean? So my advice to the Biden campaign was not let Trump be Trump, but let Joe be Joe. My guess is that Trump, and I'm fascinated to hear Tom's view of this. I don't see how Trump does himself a service by going to that debate on Thursday as the Trump that we saw in the first debate. He's got to climb above that 42% that he's stuck at. And the only way you do that is to get those moderate suburban undecided voters. And the only way you do that is to just be calm, right? And so if he does that, and maybe he tries to take some interesting tactics towards Biden, maybe he just says, Joe, you answer the question. Maybe he tries to force Biden to take time and see what happens. If he does that stuff, I think Joe just has to repeat. All he has to do is sit on his lead, repeat the kind of performance that we saw. I'm sorry, I don't know who that is. Sorry about that. That's me. That's on me. Repeat his performance from the first debate, and I think he'll be fine.
I think the president needs Joe to make a mistake to have a better impact on it than what he might do. But what is amazing, and it's like Bob Dole in 1996, if there's anyone out there who remembers that race, is his wit and his charm is amazing to this day. And I'm a big fan, and I consider myself a guy that just admires Dole. But the nation never saw that. If you really watch Trump as a businessman, many times he's very quiet, very charming, and is moving you where he's trying to get to. You don't see any of that on the national stage, whether it was last night in his rally or certainly in that first debate. It was his style of what he wanted to do, and it was very combative. And finally, apparently, incumbent presidents seem to have a tendency where that first debate, they are just wrapped a little tight on both parties when we went through some history of it. So the question is, can he be at the top of his game on Thursday, and can he put Joe to where Joe has a flub? And what's that mean?
That's really interesting. Let's move to the Senate races right now. We can come back to the presidential race if the audience has more questions on that, which I suspect they will. But in the Senate races, so if we'll just set this up, the Democrats need to net 3 seats to win control, assuming Joe Biden wins the presidency and Kamala Harris becomes the tie-breaking vote in the Senate. There are currently 14 Senate seats rated as competitive by the Cook Political Report. 2 of those are held by Democrats, 12 of them are held by Republicans. So that means the GOP is playing defense in this election right now. The 538 forecast currently gives Democrats a 75% chance of winning control of the Senate. So assuming Democrats lose the Alabama seat where Senator Doug Jones is the underdog, and challenge that assumption if you'd like, what are the 4 most likely seats that Democrats might be able to pick up? Steve, do you have some thoughts?
I think so. They're at 47. I think we lose Jones in Alabama. Then we pick up, so that brings us down to 46. I think we pick up Kelly in Arizona and Hickenlooper in Colorado. So that brings us to 48. And then there are some pure toss-ups. Iowa. So all the Democrats have to do to get to 50 and then have Kamala Harris break the tie is pick up 2 from Iowa, Maine, Montana, North Carolina, South Carolina. So they have a lot of room, right, to see if how they get from 48 to 50. And Tommy, I was listening to a Cook Political Report presentation on Monday, and they were saying that the 2 Georgia races and Alaska are really in play. Would you have ever believed that Senate races in Alaska and Georgia would be competitive in our contemporary with our service?
Just starting this cycle, first of all, last cycle, the Senate Republicans were on offense, and it was the Senate Democrats who were on defense. So in this cycle, it was well known that Republicans would be on defense, but they also assumed they had an incumbent president that was moving forward, a strong economy. And we then add the factors that have been from the pandemic being really one of the top issues in most everyone's race. And so I don't disagree with Steve on assessments. McSally on the Republican side, Arizona, has trailed all the way through this. That race is getting nasty out there, and we'll see whether it gets any movement and what the undercount taken might be a little bit in Arizona from how it's read. But Arizona, when we get to the discussion here, the demographics are different in the states where these are coming about. Arizona is no longer Barry Goldwater state. The retirees are coming from Chicago, Midwest out there, just as Florida has many New Yorkers and New Jerseyans that are now residents of Florida. Colorado, anybody I talked to, including I think Cory Gardner, knew that it's a tough race. Chuck Schumer recruited the candidate he wanted, the former governor of the state, and that makes that just very real as it grinds out. The two things that I would say on other seats that are all vulnerable and are in play is that I don't know which ones will inch it out. Can Tillis inch out North Carolina? Are there enough Democrats to really come out and defeat Lindsey Graham in South Carolina? Does Daines keep enough footing to stay ahead of the Montana race with Governor Bullock? In Maine, it always looks like a challenge, but as you know, the Electoral College has two separate votes in Maine, and there's both an emphasis by the Trump campaign as well as Collins to try to have Maine 2 turn out a little better. So as we look at these, there is going to be races that come in to where maybe the Republicans hold it, they lose some seats, and it's a narrow majority, which Cook kind of likes to talk about is going to be 5 to 10 seats or whatever. So he has a range in some of this. But I also have been around in caucus politics. It's like dominoes. And Chuck Schumer in 2006, when he chaired the senatorial committee, when I chaired the House Republicans, he needed all 10 to fall, and he got them, just based on the year it was in 2006. So in this, it could fall, and that seat could, we could see the Senate go as high as 54 Democrats. It could end where there's a miraculous evening of Senate Republicans where there's 51 Republicans left standing. But it won't quite be, because I do believe Georgia is going to find at least 1, if not 2 seats in runoff later in the year. So we're still going to have then an emphasis, as Steve and I have seen in special elections in the Senate, to where the whole world is going to have to watch Georgia play out on the specials that are there, likely for control of the Senate or for an enrichment of a party in the Senate.
So Tom, you mentioned you've been studying up on the 1980 race, the Reagan race, which was pretty interesting parallels, because you had a incumbent president who had some political troubles, and Reagan kind of came in. Looking at and I've been actually, I just finished Reaganland by Rick Perlstein, and the Institute of Politics just had Rick Perlstein on as one of their events. Steve has led a fantastic book series on political books, so I would encourage everybody to tune in for that as well. But 1980 looks interesting to me in terms of the Senate races, because I was a political junkie even when I was a young boy, and I remember Birch Bayh losing his seat at about 6:30 that night, and it seemed like every half hour, 45 minutes, another Democratic senator went down, and by the end of the evening, Democrats had lost 12 seats. Could we see something like that happen in the Senate this year, Steve?
No, I don't think so. I think it's much tighter. So I don't think you're going to see. Look, this could be a wave election, but I don't see. At the most optimistic prediction for Democrats is at 55. That's the ceiling, that they end up at 55, so that would be a wave. I don't see a tsunami. Okay. I just want to say, I think it's possible we're going to end up with a 50-50 Senate. When I do the math, and this has been such a crazy, volatile political season. So why not continue it and land squarely at a 50-50 Senate? It's entirely possible.
It isn't. I mean, and you recall, 2 years ago where there was a wave in at least the House races. But the Republicans actually picked up some Senate seats and expanded their majority there. Why don't we move?
Taking that, remember, I said that the Republicans had kind of a more of an offensive board 2 years ago, and that's part of how that ended up with the increase, where the House seats really didn't see any aspect of having anything other than 435 of them up and away you go. And they certainly lacked being able to get a vote out that gave them any hope of having a majority.
One interesting thing about the Senate races, a Pew Research poll came out this afternoon, which showed that only 4% of voters in states that have a Senate race plan on splitting their ticket. 96% of voters will vote the same party. There is no more ticket splitting in the United States. And so that's why what we've seen over the last several cycles is Senate seats tend to go the way of the presidential race.
Much more parliamentarian in what America is doing on some of their voting. It reminds me more of what, when I was a little boy, maybe the parties had a little more down ballot. My wife is a native of Texas, her father as a yellow dog Democrat said, if you can't vote straight Democrat, don't bother going to the polls. So we are seeing a parliamentarian piece of that. And that's why I think the Senate really understands that it's up for grabs.
Yeah. So in this next segment, let's move to the House races, and this is something where the audience should know you guys have you guys have faced off, and this is probably where your expertise on the nitty-gritty of each of these districts in the county level politics probably plays in. At the start of this cycle, though, as I mentioned, Democrats picked up 40 seats in the 2018 midterm blue wave. But at the start of this year, the Cook Political Report thought it was likely that Democrats would give back some of those seats, probably up between 5 to 15, according to David Wasserman, who's their House analyst, a first-rate analyst as well.
Yes,
but in a briefing that Steve was on earlier this week, Wasserman revised his forecast and has the Democrats now on track to pick up an additional 5 to 15 seats.
Yeah, same numbers, different party.
I'm one that pays close attention to David Foster. And
he's fantastic.
He's cautious, but he's very bright and he's a superb analyst. And so I think we're in for a night that could find the Republicans trying to scratch for every place they can to gain seats in the House. So it could happen. Some of that will depend on what the president's doing in some of those districts, including in New York, including next door to where Steve represented. If the president gets a decent vote in Long Island, that open seat of New York 2 could come our way easier than it's being ground out right now as an open seat. If Staten Island continues to give the Republicans the support it has, Max Rose is going to know he's been through a race, and we could see that seat flip. Claudia Tenney is running against Congressman Brindisi. She lost him 2 years ago. It's very obvious that both the campaign committees and the outside groups believe that that's strong enough Trump that they can take it back. And the Democrats are on defense, but they are putting mighty dollars in there to make sure that they give Brindisi every bit of opportunity to hold his seat. But that's all over the country like that, and kind of a dog eat dog. But the Republicans are on defense. I think the president's numbers are not what they were in 16 in some of these seats. So when I look at Virginia seats that were won by Democrats, I don't see that there's an outright pathway. There might be a pathway. Certainly that's the way it is in the upper Great Lakes, where some of those battles are going on. And some people that are demographically changed in seats that keep looking like they're trending more Republican, they might be saved by their incumbency, the year they have to get another term in, just based on what we're seeing out there as a whole. Yeah, Wasserman is not lost on the reality that things will need to happen dramatically between now and election day to see Republicans gain seats. The question is, will they hold what they have?
So Steve, what caused the Cook forecast to swing so much over the course of this year? Are there any larger trends, specific, similar types of districts that are moving towards the Democrats? What do you see out there?
The president, and the president.
The three answers.
And within that, you have COVID and the economy. So Tom and I both know that, you know, presidents have coattails and reverse coattails. And if you have a president who's at 42% job approval, and you're in that president's party down ballot, it's a tough deal. It's a tough deal. So I remember in my own district on Long Island, which Barack Obama won handily in 2008. I mean, 2010 was just miserable. I went from people who wanted to put me on their shoulders in 2008 and parade me around the neighborhoods to people who would barely make eye contact with me because I was in Obama's party. And that was the Tea Party year. So your numbers are affected by what is happening at the top of the ticket. In a lot of those districts, those Trump Democratic districts, meaning districts that voted for Donald Trump, but also voted for Democratic incumbent, the DCCC was petrified about losing those seats. But in those very swing districts, the president's numbers went down and the Republican brand went down. Now, in fairness, there are a number of Democratic seats actually that that my party is worried about, and strangely, they're longtime incumbents. So Colin Peterson in Minnesota, who's been there, who's chairman of the Ag Committee, who's loved by farmers. I mean, I think Trump won that district, 15, 20 points. It's a tough deal for Colin Peterson. Peter DeFazio, chairman of the
Republican seat held by a Democrat in the country, Collins.
I'm sorry.
It is the most Republican seat held by a Democrat in the country, I believe, is Colin Peterson. And it's gotten more that way over the last couple terms.
Yeah. And Peter DeFazio in Oregon, of all places,
surprising when I first heard that.
Isn't it? Like, everything is surprising about this cycle.
Also, I think that two things are also in play here. One, demographics are a factor. In Georgia, when I first heard districts like 6 and 7, which are the suburbs of Atlanta, were in quite the extent of battles that they were started, not this cycle, but prior. It shows some of the demographic pieces there. I also thought that some parts of Florida were trending away from us that are in play, but some by the personality of the Republican candidates, such as Florida 26, which is Miami. And then when you look at the second thing, redistricting by the courts, which has been an active piece. North Carolina, we as Republicans start losing by 2 seats just in what happened in North Carolina, drawing temporary lines for this election. 2 incumbents retired that were Republican. So we have to make 2 seats up someplace in order to hold to the roughly 201, although there's some vacancies. So it's 197 and an independent who will be gone in Amash. As we look here, there's going to be surprises on election night, partly by Steve's observation of the president and partly by people inching out a race either to the betterment of the party they are with or at the expense of the party, depending on which side you're looking at, a Republican or Democrat. We'll see surprises, and there's always surprises now.
Can I just add one thing to that? And that is that a lot of those Democratic incumbents who flipped seats in 2018, they knew that they had a steep path to climb to get reelected. And one of the things they did very well is they front-ended their fundraising. And these people just amassed huge amounts of money, may have scared off superior opposition, and just front-loaded the money. And as
I believe in peace through strength, Steve.
Peace through strength. That's right. And I've always said, and I know Tom understands the same thing. You win the back end by the front end in a congressional race. Right?
Politics is the mother's milk of, or money is the mother's milk of politics. And what is amazing, to the Democratic credit, is, let's just take, because I happen to have seen it, Max Rose in Staten Island. He has 4-to-1 cash on hand when the height of this campaign was starting, over his Democratic opponent or Republican opponent, who's a former candidate for mayor, is certainly no babe in the woods of understanding what you have to do in both raising money and having an audience to do that in New York City. 4-to-1. And then you add the depth of that by the party committees. The Democratic Party was stronger, and then the outside group. So we're seeing at all levels. Republicans had that perception of being able to raise and have more money at the end of the game. That will not be the case. The president is going to be outspent by the most prolific fundraiser in the history of the country, Joe Biden. It's already evident right now, and he's got at least 100 million more to put on the table as he finishes. That same thing is in the Senate. Think about James Harrison in South Carolina. Lindsey Graham, incumbent, raises $28 million. James Harrison raises $57 million in the third quarter. And when you look at House seats, it is staggering. And I was a good fundraiser. I know what it takes. And they have dwarfed what we were doing in the era that Steve and I served at the level of small donors energized and writing checks and getting it done. Act Blue has come into a blossom. I think I saw their figure was $1.5 billion in their aggregate fundraising, which are usually small dollar donations to candidates.
So, Steve, I don't want to leave the House without talking about Nancy Pelosi. She's obviously a historic figure in American politics. You know her well. Is she going anywhere as Speaker?
No, although she, she often talked about how she wanted to spend more time with her 9 grandchildren and less time supervising, 200 and whatever the number was, Democrats in the House of Representatives. My guess would be that if Biden wins, she's going to feel an obligation to shepherd his agenda through a caucus that is rather diverse. And so, people on the left are going to want to pull the agenda to the left. People on the right are going to want to pull the agenda further to the right. Nobody can figure out how to balance the equities better than Nancy Pelosi. And so I think she's going to be a real partner with Joe Biden if Joe Biden wins in spearheading and protecting his legislative agenda and getting things done. What happens in 2022 remains to be seen.
So along
the master politician, and I say that with great admiration of her skill set. Mm-hmm. There's no one I know that listens better to what her conference is saying, thinking, and doing, and then knowing what to do to react to it. And I served under her as speaker in her first round. From my distant viewpoint of now afar and watching, she's only gotten better as she's come into a second run as speaker. And she's going to stay either way. If Biden wins, to carry it out, as Steve said, and if not, she is going to be the loyal opposition to Donald J. Trump's second term.
And she will manage the transition. My guess is if President Trump is reelected, she's going to stay to make sure that the transition is orderly and reflects her own priorities and the priorities of her caucus.
So how does she do that? How does she manage to keep a caucus together that has a Max Rose from Staten Island to an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the Bronx? Steve, how does she balance the caucus?
Well, look, the best answer I can give you is to paint a picture of what it's like to go into her office. And I would go in 2-3 times a day. I'd be summoned, over a 4-year period to talk about legislation or some political issues. When you walk into her office, there's a bowl of Ghirardelli chocolates on the coffee table. And across the room, there's a stack of baseball bats. As if to say, we can do this the sweet way, we can do it the hard way, but we will do it. And that's what she does. I mean, she uses every tool in her toolbox. And Tom is absolutely right. The reason that the caucus, no matter where you are in the caucus ideologically, you know that she listens to you. And in politics, 70% of the battle, right, is just listening and feeling like you've been listened to. At that point, you can accommodate, you can compromise. She will wear you out. She will be on the phone with you at 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning to listen to you.
It speaks volumes if you look at her schedule. I don't know how she does it, but pure adrenaline, discipline, and love of this business. She knows everything there is to know about every member, even her adversaries.
Yep.
Well, as I think I've mentioned to you before, Steve, I am a huge fan of the Robert Caro books on Lyndon Johnson. And I am looking forward to the series of books that someone writes on Nancy Pelosi when all is said and done, because I don't know if we've seen a politician quite so powerful or have an ability to use political power like she has. It's been pretty remarkable.
Yeah.
One quick question for you, Tom. If Kevin McCarthy, the Republican leader in the House, if David Wasserman is right and Republicans lose 5 to 10 more seats, can he hang on to his leadership position, do you think?
Kevin is a very interesting political and governmental leader. He became the minority leader of the California legislature his first term of being elected to the assembly. He shot up through Iraq as chief deputy whip, appointed by Eric Cantor, and then became whip and attempted to have an election to speaker, and it was really the Freedom Caucus that denied that in some respects. And we're seeing reports just this week that says that Jim Jordan, among others, are going to support him. And he was masterful at giving Jim an opportunity to serve in very key roles of judiciary oversight and a seat on the Intelligence Committee. It only to win speaker as Speaker Pelosi and the speakers that I watched and served with very closely on the Republican side, you've got to win 50+1 of the entire conference of the entire Congress. You only have to win 50% of your majority or minority, depending on whether you're in the minority conference. So for him, he needs half of that. I'm telling you, he has worked that thing through months, years, including his approach, similar to Nancy's, very hands-on with these candidates. Some of them are going to win because they're filling safe Republican seats where there's been retirements or people moving to other offices. So yes, my view is Kevin McCarthy is elected leader, and Steve will be the whip. I do think there could be turbulence depending on the mood of the conference and other of the elected leadership.
Interesting. I'd like to take a moment to throw it to Natalie, and she can advise the audience on how they can ask some questions right now. Natalie, are you there?
Yeah, thank you so much. So we'll get right back to you for one last question, but I know we had some in the audience. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the raise hand function. If you go on and click on that, it'll put you in the queue and I can see that you have questions, so we'll be able to unmute. If for any reason you're not able to unmute or speak on the conference, please use the Q&A function to type in your question.
So while we wait for some of those questions to come through, I have a final kind of big picture question about, because it looks like President Trump is more likely to lose re-election here. I'm very curious. He's obviously been a disruptive force in American politics, but I'd like to know, and first to you, Steve, what happens to Trumpism if the president loses re-election? What happens to the Republican Party?
Well, Tom is better equipped to answer that question than I am. There's a theory.
Steve would like it to be exterminated.
Well, I'm setting you up, Tom, by having Steve do it first.
There's a theory that I've heard from some folks close to the president that he has figured out how to monetize the resistance. That he will leave the White House. He will buy a television network. He will be the face of the resistance, and he will profit from it. He will do his rallies and perhaps charge admission, and he will continue to be the face of a very robust resistance movement. So he has the fame and the fortune, And that means that for many of Tom and my former Republican colleagues who in quiet moments would say, yeah, I don't like, not favorable towards the guy, I don't like the guy, but they would all say, but I have to be with the guy, otherwise he's going to engineer a primary against me or tweet against me, and that would be the end of my career. I believe that that continues. I believe that a lot of members of the Republican caucus, because Trumpism will not go away, will continue to have a fidelity to him because it's the only way they survive in their districts. Tom, what do you think?
Well, I opened up our piece saying I was an old-fashioned politician. So I wish, as we look at this, that some of it goes back to the civility of Congress that our forefathers, and I don't mean a long time ago, just a few of our predecessors ago, maintained in the decorum. It started to slide some. We're watching with the advent of social media. I mean, Twitter really came into existence when I retired from the House. Donald Trump's going to be around unless something happens in this race where I've seen in politics the big guy gets beat somehow and he just goes away. I think that's wishful thinking for some that have that. I'm more inclined to think what Steve says. But we're going to see a whole new piece here. There's going to be new Trump messengers, so to speak, that are vying for the presidency, want to keep a base of what Trump had or what they perceived it is there. And we're going to see that advance. We're going to see the dynamics of the progressives and the liberals and the moderates and that on the Democratic side. And so we're going to see the dynamics really kind of get more less disciplined than more structured. I think we're seeing that if you look at the New York State legislature, and because this is coming from New York City, we're seeing the changes breaking down in lower levels of state houses and county as well. So he's around. The Republican Party will begin to pick up some of it on what's in power, but I think just as the progressives have kind of a message and a leash on the Democratic Party, the Freedom Caucus inside the Congress and Donald Trump and others will have some of that leash on the Republicans as well.
It's going to be really fascinating. I'm going to throw it back to Natalie. We have some questions from the audience for you too.
Yes, we do. And just so that everybody hears the instructions one more time, if you look to the bottom of your screen, you'll see a raised hand function. If you click on that, it will let me know that you're in the queue. So our first question comes from Adam Shapiro. Adam, if you could unmute yourself, please, you're free to talk. Oh, Adam, we can come back to you. So the next.
Adam's got his mute on if he picks it up.
Yeah.
Yes, we'll see if we can come back to Adam. We also have Lori Schreiber. Lori, you can hit unmute, please.
Sorry, I didn't mean to raise my hand.
Oh,
Adam, back to
very
you.
Interesting. Thank you. Yes, Adam, back to you.
all right. In the chat, we have a question from Matthew. He says, SCOTUS, assume Dems 51 plus in the Senate, Biden stack the court, follows with a mandate from the election. What happens if this flips back to rep? How many justices can work when they double stack? Is there a limit?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question where, you know, if the Democrats were to abolish the legislative filibuster, if they were to then, you know, add seats to the Supreme Court, do other things that they no longer need to overcome the 60-vote filibuster, you know, or the 60-vote cloture vote, what happens to our politics, you know, if the majority, you know, switches back and forth? It's a pretty interesting question.
Look, I worry about that. I did a piece in the Hill today where I said that we need to take the Supreme Court debate out of the passions of the moment, out of a presidential year, and appoint an independent commission. I know people, you know, say commissions, all they do is do reports that sit on the shelf. But you know what? The Supreme Court is too important for us to allow it to be subject to the whims and passions of politics by either party. And if ever there was a need for a truly independent commission of scholars to suggest reforms and modernization of an institution, it is now towards the Supreme Court. I worry that, politics, if it's going to be a game of retribution, Tegan, the Democrats will put 2 justices on in 2021, and then the Republicans, when and if they return to the White House and to the majority, will stick another 2 on, and before you know it, we're gonna have a Supreme Court with a bunch of political hacks in robes that and have 15 to 20 to 25. Supreme Court only changed its numbers 6 times since its first session in 1789. I don't want to be in a position where we're going to change it 6 times in the next decade or so. So I'm hopeful that we can allow cooler heads prevail and have this debate outside of the passions and the intensity of politics.
Do you agree, Tom? What would be an appropriate way? Do you think there should be reforms to the Supreme Court? I know Republicans, your party has worked so hard to get this majority that they have now of appointees to the court. Would you think Republicans would support some reforms to the court?
It'll be interesting as calmer heads prevail as we get past the election, regardless of the outcome of the vote that McConnell has scheduled next week. I am an old New York legislator before coming to Congress, and New York taught me, including being ruled by Democratic speakers, that commissions and referendums are not important particular aspects of solving governmental solutions. So I'm interested in where Steve would take the commission of the scholars and others, but there's usually retaliation. Harry Reid broke the first nuclear option, and Mitch McConnell sent a heavier one in, as we did circuit courts and the Supreme Court to it. So there'll be a tendency of the Democratic Party said, you did this, we're doing this. And so is there a calmness in order to preserve and protect the integrity of the equal branch of the judiciary? And I'm one that also looks to 3 aspects of equal branches of government. And we need to be very careful once we get through this on how we determine that. And then the question is, because we've talked about interesting times, there's been a movement by younger senators wanting to break the filibuster for years, and some have even retired that were young senators and moved on. So the question that will be in the dynamics of this majority, assuming it's now a Senate majority that could retaliate, is what do they want to do relative to protecting the filibuster and the moderation that the Senate offers versus the People's House? I love the unruliness of the House and the bubbling of what it is of the issue of the day. But it's also, as much as I have condemned, much like a beloved speaker of mine, Tip O'Neill, on the fact the enemy isn't Steve Israel, it's the other body. And so the question is the moderation of the Senate on this deliberation as far as how fast we move. That was the founders' viewpoint of why they put some of that in on the compromises they got to. So it will change Americans' democracy dramatically if the filibuster is eliminated, and then there's strong support for that, and there has been strong support against it. And I think we're going to see that crossroads. I think that's one of the first things they're going to have to try to get through, regardless of who comes in. And if it's a Democratic majority, there's going to be new members, there's going to be some new thinking, and they've just experienced whatever's happened in the Supreme Court vote.
So we have a question in the chat from Tracy Thatcher, who asks, why are no male Republican senators willing to support women's reproductive rights?
I didn't hear that, Tegan.
She asks, why are no male Republican senators willing to support women's reproductive rights? She's looking at the Senate mainly, and obviously this is an issue with Amy Coney Barrett's nomination, which is coming up next week.
Well, Steve would have an opinion that you just can't find them. I said, I think our parties have seen pro-life and choice move into a comfort zone of your party affiliation. When I first was involved in politics, I wouldn't know whether they're pro-choice, pro-life until either votes or some of those issues came out. It's now a pretty fair assumption that most Republicans are pro-life, and they're that way because they believe it, and it's an issue that they're comfortable enough with that they have to both promote and defend as they go out for an election every 6 years in the Senate or every 2 years in the House. And while there have been moderate Democrats, there's less and less, and they're more pro-choice. While there have been more moderate Republicans, there's less and less relative to a social issue such as pro-life, pro-choice.
So, another question along the lines of, at the times that we live in, there was a time when I worked in the Senate where Republican and Democratic staffers used to get together after hours, and we used to talk. And if most Americans could watch you, Tom and Steve, talk today in a very civil way about the country and about the country's politics, things might be different. A Republican senator actually said to me the other day that he thought if Joe Biden were to win the presidency, that would be just enough that a lot of Republican senators needed to actually meet him in the middle, because there are senators such as Senator Romney, perhaps Senator Ben Sasse from Nebraska, who might want to shake Trumpism, so to speak. And Joe Biden is obviously somebody who, for all of his years in the Senate, looked forward to making bipartisan deals. Do you think that's a valid scenario? Do you think we could see that?
Tegan, boy, do I wish that's correct. I think the whole country wants that to happen. I think it's maybe easier for some senators to do that than some House members, because if you're a House member and you show signs of cooperation with the other party, you're bound to get a primary. I mean, the country's just so polarized that if you're a Republican and you work with a Democratic president, you're going to be challenged. That's what happened to Eric Cantor. Eric Cantor was the Republican leader and got primaried because his opponent, Dave Brat, said he was too conciliatory towards Barack Obama. So I don't see a lot of that happening in the House unless you have a very moderate district, but there's a risk there as well. I also want to say one other thing, because I think this is important. When you watch CNN and MSNBC and Fox, you see the thrashing and the screaming and, the gridlock and the partisan vitriol. But the place actually is much calmer than that. That was at least my experience. So it's like a storm, in the ocean. You see the frothing and the waves and the violence, but it's pretty calm underneath. And I could always, particularly because Tom and I were in the same delegation from New York, we could always sit down, right? It's just that's not interesting on cable television, that Reynolds and Israel would sit down and figure something out. There's a balcony right off the floor of the House that only members are allowed to use. You could go out there and sprawl on cheap patio furniture and talk as human beings. And it would be amazing because you'd go from this war zone on the floor of the House out one door, and you're sitting there like, human beings again. We need more of that. We definitely need more of that. And that's going to require not just our political leaders to compromise, but people to be more, less repulsed by compromise. We're all going to have to calm down and meet in the middle.
Yeah. Tom, do you think that's possible?
Well, I'm that eternal optimist that the public will demand it and we'll finally get there. But there's some things that have changed in Congress. Barbara Conable and Jack Kemp, who were congressmen that I took their seats, they lived in Washington. Jack Kemp in Bethesda and Barbara Conable down there. So their kids were playing baseball or playing in recitals with Democrats that lived in the same communities. And there's kind of a class structure like there is our neighborhood. Some were living in Georgetown, some lived in the suburbs of Virginia, but they were with Democrat and Republicans at night after a day in session, after a debate and saying, hey, what do you really think of that, while they're on the sidelines of their kid's ball game or coming in or out of recital. That's missing now, because more than half of the Congress commutes back and home, and I commuted my entire stretch there. The second piece, the last traveling trip I took in Congress was led by a Democratic Cornell leader named Steve Israel. And so whatever Steve and I got to know, our time in Afghanistan in less than ideal conditions gave us and others on that trip a very unique opportunity to get to know each other. And I'll give you an example. Bobby Rush. I went with then Speaker Hassert to a long trip. Bobby was on that. At the end of that week, I got to know a lot about the person, Bobby Rush, who I would not normally see nor have as much in common with as a suburban rural legislator and someone who represents the city of Chicago. And so that travel is less all the way around. It's less by somebody else funding it, such as Cornell wanting to show off something, or by the Cadells themselves. And so we're lacking that interaction of members getting to know each other as human beings, as fellow survivors of mankind, and as people who have needs, wants, concerns, fears, and aspirations within the Congress that might be similar. And our schedules are so demanding. It's not like in the state legislature when I was there, you do the fundraising circuit from 5:30 to 8. You can then join a group of people at 8 o'clock for dinner because everybody's kind of done then. This is everybody doing whatever they have for schedules. And I used to think of an old Buffalo native and Neil Abercrombie, who was from Hawaii. When the rest of us were thinking about going to bed, he started communicating with his district in Hawaii because the time zone was 6 hours behind Washington. We need to see some of that come back. There's been many quality members of Congress trying. It just hasn't happened. And as Steve talked, some of that dynamics is all politics is local, and that means what's the primary season look like?
Tom, do you remember another Republican who was on that trip to Afghanistan?
Trying to think who was.
Get ready. You know who was on that trip? He was so quiet during the whole trip that I myself forgot that he was on the trip. Mike Pence.
That's right.
He was on that trip. I have a picture of him in body armor. I may just have to use that. Can I just pick up on what Tom is saying, because he's so right. I'll give you my own example. I was invited on a congressional delegation, and I heard that Congressman Phil Gingrey, a Republican from Georgia, was on that trip. And I said to my chief of staff, "Oh, I hate that guy. Every time I see him, he's on Fox News calling me a socialist, calling my party socialist. When he's on the floor, all he's doing is he's breathing fire. I don't want to go on that Codell with Phil Gingrey." And of course I went, and I said, "Well, just make sure I'm not sitting next to him on the plane." And of course the Air Force sat me next to him on the plane. When you're sitting with somebody for 12 hours on your way to Afghanistan, you start to realize that you have a hell of a lot in common. And I became really close with Phil Gingrey after that. We disagreed on almost everything, but we began to relate to each other as human beings. People think that those trips, they call them junkets. First of all, going to Afghanistan, no great shakes. Not a lot of luxury hotels in Kabul. But also they were bonding opportunities. They got members, as Tom says, to just talk about their common ground instead of trying to take cheap shots at one another.
There was a remarkable thing that happened earlier this week in Utah in the gubernatorial race, where the Democrat and Republican running for governor of Utah actually appeared in a joint ad together and said exactly what you just did, Steve, which is we may disagree on a lot of things, but we don't hate each other, and calling for civility in these final days. So what I think would be good is to end it on that note. And I want to thank you both for taking part in a really, really interesting discussion. And I know I speak for the Cornell Family Fellows who are here as well. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Tommy, I'll talk to you soon, buddy.
You too.
Bye.
Thank you, Tegan. Great.
Care, guys.
Thanks.